Hello guys, how are you all doing? I hope everyone is doing good today. And today we are entering a new section in our literary translation class. And if earlier you translated audiovisual materials like movies or interviews or basically anything that has video, now you are going to do something a little bit different. A little bit different because you still have the visual element, but of course you don't have the audio element here. We are going to do comics translation. And what I want to present to you today is basically a rendering or a summary of an article that you will have to read. The article is not very long, but I believe it has what you need to generally know about comics translation. And and today the topic of that particular article is the concept of fidelity or faithfulness. How do we see faithfulness in comics translation? That's what we will be looking at in this article. And now let us go to the article. And at the end of this video, you will know what kind of follow-up you need to take after seeing this video. All right, now let us go to this part. Let me turn off my camera. So fidelity is an important concept in translation. You talked about fidelity or faithfulness or accuracy in general and in translation and interpretation class, right? And in this class, you also talked relatively a lot about fidelity or infidelity. And in literary context, in literary translation, we talk less about fidelity, but what we do about the text. And now we are going there again, but there will be, of course, something else that we will find in this discussion. In general, the principles of comics translation can be taken from literary translation. But there are, of course, details in literary translation that we don't have in other types of translation, including audiovisual translation. Okay, the first thing that we have to realize when we are about to talk about the fidelity in comics translation is the concept of fidelity in literary translation in general. My apologies, let me close my window. Yeah. Uh, in general, there are two types of position. The one that is more towards the source, which is called the sorcerer, and the one that leans towards the target or the targeteer. I have talked about this many times, and by now I believe you are already familiar with this concept. So I won't torture you further with that. And there is also this notion of foreignization and domestication. When we talked about foreignization, we talk about people who preserve the strangeness of our translation and those who prefer to eliminate the strangeness and make the translation more like a native work or a domesticated work. And those concepts have been discussed a lot in the previous class. And here I want to highlight only several of them, okay? And I will give you examples like from Schleiermacher and Benjamin and Berman. These people lean towards foreignization. They prefer to maintain the strangeness of the work as a way to respect the work, okay? We need to know that this particular work is not from Indonesia. That's why we still need to keep it like that by preserving the strangeness, by focusing more on every single element of the work, so that the readers in the target language can imagine themselves that the work is actually has a lot of things, and we as readers are responsible to dig and find the values of the work. We are not supposed to be spoon-fed by the translator. That's what these people think. And that's why they prefer to use the foreignization to keep the work foreign. And Benjamin even says that a work in the original is actually just a reflection of the actual work, which is in the ideal world, ideal realm. This is like the Aristotelian, sorry, the Platonic idea of the ideals. So according to Benjamin, even the original work is just a reflection of that ideal work. So the translation will also be just a reflection. If it is not similar to the original work, it's okay as long as it helps the readers to get the original work in the ideal, in the realm of ideas. Basically, these three people lean towards the same stance. But some others, they prefer to believe that foreignization is not the answer. We, as translators, can choose to see that our relation to the author or the work is dynamic. What the author wants for the readers, for their original readers, are what we as translators need to do. That's why it is just fine for us to make read read like an original work, although it is actually a translation. And that's what Nida wants us to do. We can choose to be fidel or to be faithful to the writer, but our faithfulness is not on the actual word by word of the writer, but what the writer wants uh, their audience to get in the original work. And some others, for example, George Steiner, he holds that fidelity or infidelity can be various depending on the field that we are translating. When we translate medical materials, for example, materials in the medicine, in the field of medicine, the level of faithfulness should be different from when we translate materials for religious purposes or like church materials. And when we translate church materials, the fidelity should be different from when we translate, for example, comics. So this level of fidelity changes, differ across fields. That's what we what we can get from experts when it comes to fidelity or infidelity. The first one, they believe that it is important to be faithful to the original, even though we have to create something foreign. The second one believes that the relationship between the original and the translator can be dynamic. We sometimes can make it foreign, we sometimes can make it domesticated. And Steiner believes that this depends on the field that we are translating in. So different fields have different levels of fidelity. Now, Erico Goncalvez de Assis, the one whose article you will be reading, synthesizes from these various ideas about faithfulness or fidelity. And what he comes up with is this a formula of 4 elements. The first one is we have fidelity towards source text. And when we talk about fidelity towards source text, we can choose between translating the word or translating the sense. The word means translating the actual word, and the sense here is the meaning. You can translate the meaning using a different word, right? A word that is totally different from the original. That's the first one. The second one is we have fidelity towards the readers. Sometimes it is important for us to either preserve the original, preserve the meaning of the original, And in this case, we want to preserve the strangeness because that's what a reader might need. For example, academic readers, readers who read a text to study, to analyze the value from, and so on. But sometimes we can also be uh, a translator who domesticates a text. Why? Because some of our readers want text to be enjoyed, to be read for entertainment, and so on. Okay, that's the second one. And the third one is fidelity towards the author. Now, here, when we when we talk about faithfulness towards the author, we can either commit ourselves to reproducing the same experience that the author wants to create to the author, to the readers in the original work, or we can also try to create a new reading experience for the readers. And if we do that, we sometimes have to allow ourselves to be less infidel towards the author, but towards the text. So there are these three areas of fidelity. And in addition to that, there is still a belief, according to Goncalvez, that our understanding of the text and working conditions will also determine our fidelity towards the text. There are moments when we, as translators, understand our situation and eventually decide whether we need to be very faithful or whether we need to be a little bit more free when we translate. So these are what Goncalvez synthesizes from the various positions on fidelity in literary translation. Now, when it comes to comics translation, there is one thing that we really need to know, which is the system of comics. What is the system of comics? So comics has a lot of elements that other works of art, other works of literature don't have. For example, panels. Comics have panels, while novels, short stories, and others don't. And by panels means, I mean the box in which a picture is drawn, okay? You will know panels soon. And speech balloons, you have speech balloons in comics. And double page spread, it is one particular moment when we need to read the entire spread of 2 pages for one paragraph. I will give you an example from Miss Marvel later. And strips, the sequence of panels and insets, something added, and the layout of the page. These are important elements in comics, and each of these elements has meanings. For example, panel is meaningful in that it shows you one particular moment. And another panel is the next particular moment or the previous particular moment. And the connection between one panel and the other panel creates what we call as time, okay? So the time in comics happens between one panel to another. So you cannot ignore the presence of panels. And there's also this notion of foundational, of iconic solidarity, which is a foundational element of a comic. What is iconic solidarity? It's the idea that all parts in a comic book, all elements in a comic book are working together to create meaning. So what is in panel 1 in page 1 is also related to what we can see in panel 1 in page 20, for example. So these are all interdependent. All of these elements are interdependent, and together they create meaning. So you cannot look at one panel while ignoring the next panels, okay? And This comics translation requires our understanding of these two things, the systems of comics and iconic solidarity. And how does that eventually work in practice? So in practice, comic translators, us here, we do not translate only the linguistic elements, linguistic properties like words, sentence, clauses. No, we need to also translate the other elements. We need to consider the balloons. We need to consider the page layout. For example, if you translate from Japanese manga, then you will need to consider that it should be left from left to right, for example, okay? Or uh, the other linguistic elements can be, the other non-linguistic elements can be the balloons. The size of the balloons will determine how you will translate the sentence in it or the word in it. Yep. So whatever you do as a translator actually will disrupt the whole composition, the whole comic. And for that, you need to be aware, because a comic is not only an image and words, but they are images and words combined together, creating meaning in what Goldstein calls the iconic solidarity. Okay, now, again, let's go back to the notion of fidelity then. So how can we be faithful to the text if we translate comics, considering all those things? So here is how we will do it, okay? When it comes to linguistic science and in relation to the source text, we need to decide based on our situation whether we want to translate the word or we want to translate the sense. If you know that you have this freedom, then you will not be bound to translate a word in only its equivalent in Indonesian. Sometimes you will need to translate the sense. You can use a totally different set of words or sentences to create the same meaning. And when it comes to fidelity to the author, to the source author, you can later decide what the author actually wants to convey to the audience, wants to create to the audience, what feeling the author wants to create to the audience, and decide for yourself whether the situation allows you to do that or whether you need to be creating a different experience, a different reading experience. Will you be committed to the author or will you be uncommitted to the author? That's how you will see this. And if you understand this, then you will later be freer in finding expressions. And finally, you will need to also realize what kind of readers you will be addressing. And when you know what readers you are addressing, then you will later be able to decide, okay, what kind of readers you're addressing and what kind of audience that the publisher wants to address. You will later decide whether you will make it a foreign sounding translation or whether you want to make it an Indonesian sounding translation of comics. And the same thing also happens to the non-linguistic science, okay? When I talk about the non-linguistic science here, I'm referring to the other elements like page layout, balloons, or even the onomatopoeic elements like the screaming, the sound of screaming in the background, whether you want to change the scream into an Indonesian sounding scream or whether you want to keep it that way, that also depends on your evaluation of the working conditions, the context of your translation. Again, it depends on your working conditions. You need to consider all of these elements, okay, the source text, the source author, the target audience, and your working conditions. Now, in practice, let me summarize what kind of moves you need to do as a translator. First of all, when you translate a comic book, when you are going to be a comics translator, you need to consider the non-linguistics elements, okay? These elements will determine how you will need to translate. Where your text is positioned, whether you will be translating from Japanese or whether you will be translating from Korean or whether you're translating from English and so on. It will depend, it will determine your translation. Consider all those things. And you will also need to consider the length of your translation. As usual, I believe now you already know the importance of, uh, of adjusting the length of your translation. However, in this case, it will be a bit different from audiovisual translation, because here your reader actually has all the time in the world to read your translation. So actually, you are not bound by time when it comes to the length, but you are bound by the space. You cannot use a long sentence when the space is limited, but you can use, for example, difficult sentences, difficult words, or words that can imply certain meanings. So level of difficulties can, I mean, your translation can be a bit less simple than the translation that you use in audiovisual translation. But the length should still obey the limitation. And the third one is working conditions, and they include the purpose, the the purpose of that translation, the target audience of your translation, and various other things like the origins of the work or your cultural context. And these are what you will need to work on, what you need to pay attention to when you translate comic books. And let me give you some examples of different purposes of translation. Here is an educational comic, and this educational comic talks about the Federal Reserve System. It's from an educational comic that I had back from the US. It tells us about how the Federal Reserve System works and how it came about and what it will be like in the future. This is educational. So the language can be as complex as possible if you need to. It can be not so simple because it is really educational to educate people, but not for very young children who do not understand complex words, for example. And this one is a comic that I got from Webtoons, one that I believe has not been translated into Indonesian. This one is quite delicate because it has tones, sarcasm, references, and very critical in one point at certain points. And some people can be very offended by this comics. It's called The Adventures of God. And this also has a different purpose. This has a different working condition. And these all will eventually determine how you translate these works. I'm sorry for taking extreme examples, but by showing the extremes, I believe you can imagine what can be found in between these two ends of the spectrum. All right, guys, I think that's all for now. I will give you further information about your assignment today, which is translating the first couple of pages from Ms. Marvel for practice, for educational purposes only, and it's not going to be for public. All right, thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you soon.